It was one of the most intense battles of the Renaissance. A battle of texts and ideas where humanists clashed with obscurantists, poets with priests, kings with emperors, and even the popes took sides. There was everything: public attacks and pamphlets, philosophical writings and political fractions, courtroom trials, bonfires, blackmail, and the largest campaign to destroy Jewish books and Judaism in Europe before the 20th century. My name is Armen Zakarian, and today we're traveling 500 years back in time into the heart of the Renaissance to explore one of the most tense and uncontrollable literary, although not just literary, conflicts of that era. We'll talk about the Reuchlin controversy, the pamphlet war that shook Europe, and the letters of obscure men, one of the strangest and most stunning texts of the age. This is a story that once rocked the entire continent and then got lost in time. But today, it's coming back into your life, and soon you won't believe it all didn't happen to us. On the morning of August 1st, 1509, somewhere near the Italian city of Padua, a man named Johannes Pfefferkorn woke up in quite a state of excitement. Today, he was to be received by the emperor. Johannes, however, hadn't always been known under that name. Not long ago, he was a Joseph, a Jew from Bohemia, the nephew of a rabbi. Now, however, he was standing at the gates of imperial court as a newly baptized Catholic from Cologne. To understand what Pfefferkorn planned to discuss with the emperor and how he ended up in Padua, we need to go back 6 years, to 1503. The High Renaissance is in full bloom across Europe. Leonardo da Vinci is painting the Mona Lisa. Michelangelo is carving David. Erasmus of Rotterdam is deep in ancient Greek. And in the midst of it all, a Jewish man named Joseph Pfefferkorn from Prague. Why not? He too is searching for meaning in this striking, magnificent age. That search takes him to Cologne, and it ends, or rather begins, with baptism. Of Pfefferkorn's life as a Jew we know almost nothing, as if his biography simply starts with the words "Ego te baptizo in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." He was 36, the same age I am now, when he became a Christian. And since the age of real crusades had ended more than 2 centuries earlier, yet a new convert demands action, Pfefferkorn launched a crusade of his own. A crusade against his former faith. His new occupation now is agitation and propaganda. Over the next 6 years, he published 4 pamphlets, all calling for the conversion of the Jews. The speed and, more precisely, the direction of Pfefferkorn's ideological evolution, if you can call it that, can be traced even just by reading the titles of his works. If in 1507 he wrote The Jewish Mirror, urging the Jews to turn to Christ, then by 1509 that had transformed into the short and ugly The Enemy of the Jews. In that text, Pfefferkorn lays out his agenda clearly. Jews, he claimed, were more dangerous than the devil. They were, in his words, a cursed people beyond reason or salvation. They must be silenced, their role in society erased. Pfefferkorn called for forced conversions and state-backed censorship, framing it all as a noble defense of the Christian world. And soon, Pfefferkorn named his main enemy: the Jewish books, centuries of Jewish thought, law, commentary, and tradition. He proposed confiscating all Jewish religious writings except for the Hebrew Bible itself. Everything else, he argued, was the root of their moral corruption. Now, to be fair, Johannes had a certain talent. He was a persuasive agitator, good at getting attention, stirring emotions, twisting facts into conviction. But charisma alone wasn't enough to launch an empire-wide campaign to seize and destroy Jewish literature. He couldn't have done it by himself. Fortunately for him, he didn't have to. The fury of young convert caught the attention of powerful religious forces, namely the Franciscans and the Dominicans. A baptized Jew who could read Hebrew, understood Jewish holidays and rituals, and knew how to speak the language was a perfect weapon in the campaign against Judaism in Germany. And so a coalition began to form around Pfefferkorn, a group of clergy, officials, and church scholars who saw in him the right man in the right place at the right time. The support Pfefferkorn received from the religious orders was not just symbolic, it was strategic. Though he wrote his pamphlets in rough German and had only a shaky command of Latin, his works were soon translated into polished academic Latin and published in impressively large print runs for the time. These texts were distributed to universities, monasteries, episcopal courts, cathedral schools, and clerical councils, anywhere they might find eager hands to wield them. The campaign at the time lacked one final ingredient to be turned into a full-blown political movement, imperial blessing. And that was soon given by the emperor's sister. Kunigunde of Austria, a devout and widowed archduchess, was deeply moved by his fiery words and holy mission. She wept, embraced his cause, and wrote a heartfelt letter to her brother, Emperor Maximilian, urging him to support the confiscation of Jewish books. With her blessing in hand, Pfefferkorn now had something close to a divine endorsement. And it was with that letter, flanked by Franciscan and Dominican brothers, that Johannes Pfefferkorn arrived near Padua, where Emperor Maximilian was at the time waging war against Venice. And so, on August 1st, 1509, the long-awaited audience finally took place. At first, Pfefferkorn was nervous, but as he began to speak, his voice grew stronger, his hands stopped shaking, and confidence showed in the way he stood. "Your Majesty," he declared, "the Jews keep in their synagogues countless vile writings, not only hostile to Christ, but even contrary to their own faith. They have strayed, if I may say so, not just from the Church, but from Judaism itself. Through their Talmuds, their Kabbalistic books, the endless rabbinic commentaries, and twisted tales that distort everything from the Genesis to the Law of Moses, they have, in a manner of speaking, become heretics. But that's not the worst of it. These books don't just contain lies and blasphemies, they infect, they corrupt minds and poison souls. Destroy those books, and you will tear out the root of the Jewish evil." Maximilian did his best to listen. He really did, but his thoughts kept drifting. It was a hot evening in the hills around Padua, and the fate of his military campaign troubled the 50-year-old emperor's mind much more than a handful of Jewish books. And so, having heard Pfefferkorn out, Maximilian decided not to spend more his imperial time on Jewish books than they strictly deserved. Without much deliberation, he instructed his officials to draft an appropriate mandate. Some 19 hot August days later, the world read his official message to the Jews. "We, Emperor Maximilian, are reliably informed that you have in your synagogue libraries or otherwise in your possession several false, useless books and writings that were supposedly made and maintained to scorn, ridicule, eradicate not only our holy Christian faith and its followers, but also the books and the law of Moses and the prophets. We, therefore, have told our servant and loyal subject of the empire, Johannes Pfefferkorn of Cologne, a man who is highly learned and experienced in your faith, to visit, assess, and look into all your books and writings everywhere, as to whether there should be anything in them that is against the books and the law of Moses and of the prophets. As stated above, if there should be anything false in them that would lead to shame of our holy Christian faith, then all those books are to be taken away from you and be suppressed." It was August 19, 1509. In just a few years of writing and spreading angry public booklets, Johannes Pfefferkorn of Cologne had gone from a lone street preacher to the official imperial commissioner for Jewish books. He had just turned 40. He now held an imperial mandate, the backing of the most powerful monastic orders, growing fame, and full freedom to act. His star had risen. Soon, the first actions followed. If you happen to be inside the synagogue of Frankfurt on September 28, 1509, you would have witnessed quite an unusual scene. A man of average height, clean-shaven, wearing a deliberately plain long robe, was plucking books from the shelves. That day in Frankfurt, 168 Jewish books were confiscated, the entire contents of the synagogue library. And, as you can imagine, every single one of them was declared offensive to Christianity. Now, anyone who actually read the emperor's mandate would have noticed some rather clear limitations. Books were only to be seized if they either contradicted the laws of Moses or blasphemed against Christian Church. But there was one tiny loophole, roughly the size of the Cologne Cathedral. The person appointed to determine which books fit those categories, the prosecutor, the lawyer, and the judge, was one and the same Johannes Pfefferkorn. And, as we've already seen, Pfefferkorn firmly believed that the only good Jewish book was a burned one. In his eyes, every single volume deserved confiscation and destruction. Soon, the number of seized books in Frankfurt grew tenfold, reaching over 1,500. And Frankfurt was only the beginning. Worms, Mainz, Bingen, Lorch, Landstein, and Deutz. One by one, the Rhine cities fell in line as Pfefferkorn's personal book-seizing barge sailed downriver, emptying Jewish libraries along the way. And just when it seemed that nothing could save the Jewish community and that their books were doomed, help came from the most unexpected place: the tangled, slow-moving machinery of German bureaucracy. You see, Pfefferkorn was operating in a place with a very peculiar political system. At the time, there was no unified Germany. Instead, there was the Holy Roman Empire, a state that, as Voltaire famously and accurately put it, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was a patchwork of around 2,000 territories, mostly German-speaking, each with its own level of autonomy and legal status. There were imperial cities and landgraviates, archbishoprics and duchies, and at the top of this whole glorious mass stood the emperor. But his powers were limited. The relationship between imperial and local authorities was based on a web of privileges, charters, and negotiated agreements. In many cities of the empire, Jewish communities paid special taxes, supported trade and finance, and played essential roles in the urban economy, which meant they had legal ways of defending their rights, or at least try to do so. Of course, the Jewish communities under attack didn't just stand by. They filed complaints, sent petitions, called in favors, and searched desperately for allies. Most of these efforts came to nothing, but one of them, surprisingly, paid off. After a month of hesitation, the City Council of Frankfurt finally sent a formal request to the emperor. Were Pfefferkorn's actions on their territory actually legal? Was the destruction of Jewish books truly beneficial to the Christian Church? And based on what exactly, besides Pfefferkorn's words? The emperor, seeing that doubts were now starting to appear in Frankfurt and might soon spread to Worms, then Regensburg and beyond, realized that the entire campaign could collapse into pure paperwork. So, in July 1510, gathering his advisors and interested parties in the town of Füssen, Maximilian made his position clear. He needed a document. Not a vague opinion or emotional letter, no. A proper document. A paper shield, strong enough to deflect every future challenge, whether from a city or an archbishop. To get it, the campaign to confiscate the books would be paused, pending the collection of so-called expert opinions. Those experts had to answer one plain and simple question: would the destruction of Jewish books benefit the Christian faith? Maximilian ordered 4 of the empire's leading universities, Cologne, Mainz, Heidelberg and Erfurt, to provide official opinions on the matter. He also summoned 3 independent experts, a former rabbi turned priest named Victor of Carbon, the Dominican prior and inquisitor Jacob van Hoogstraten, and a doctor of imperial law and Hebrew scholar Johannes Reuchlin. From the outside, it looked like a mere legal formality. The decision to confiscate and destroy the books had already been made at the highest level. Now it just needed the proper paperwork and the illusion of debate. The Frankfurt City Council, learning of the emperor's intentions, quietly warned the Jewish community to prepare for the inevitable return to book seizures in the near future. A representative of the Frankfurt Jews, Jonathan Kostheim, who had found himself at the imperial court, wrote back home in a shaken letter, "If you had heard and seen what I have heard and seen, fear and terror would have seized you more than I am able to write down." That fear proved justified. As the first responses to the emperor's inquiry began to arrive. They didn't sound like careful legal opinions, they read more like applause. Of the 4 universities, only Heidelberg stopped short of full endorsement. Their professors proposed holding some kind of academic conference on the matter. Erfurt delayed their response but eventually backed the idea of burning the books. Cologne acted quickly and with great eagerness, denouncing the heretical religious writings of the Jews and fully endorsing their destruction. The University of Mainz went even further, recommending that all religious books belonging to the Jews be seized, including the Hebrew Bible. Even Pfefferkorn hadn't gone that far. The independent experts also offered full support. Victor of Carbon, the former rabbi, was all in. Inquisitor Jacob Hoogstraten presented a text he called a consultation against the filthy Jewish books. He argued that destroying the books wasn't enough. The Jews themselves should face formal charges of heresy under the authority of the Church. Out of the 7 voices the emperor had consulted, 6 were already in. Only 1 abstained, while 5 supported the campaign. But that support was growing beyond that narrow circle. The powerful archbishops, theologians, professors, hundreds of representatives of the imperial elite stood behind the cause. By October 1510, everything was in place for the final crusade against Judaism. Only one formality remained: the long overdue response from Johannes Reuchlin, the legal scholar and Hebrew expert. Aside from that inconvenient delay, there was nothing to disturb the newfound harmony between the church, the universities, and the imperial court. A common enemy had been named, the time had come to destroy it. No one put it more bluntly than Inquisitor Hoogstraten, who came in his recommendation to the following conclusion: the Jewish books must be burned, and if the Jews refuse to renounce them, they themselves must be burned as well. Let's now pause our story here and leave our cast of characters behind for a moment to travel back in time to Rome. It's the spring of 1482, 30 long years before the events we've been following. A young German lawyer, 27 years old, arrives in the Eternal City. His name is Johannes. He's one of the counselors to the ruler of Württemberg, who has come to negotiate with the Pope. For our young German, it was a true miracle. He's walking the streets of Rome and Florence. He meets Pope Sixtus and Lorenzo the Magnificent, ruler of Florence, patron of the arts, guardian of the Renaissance. He sees Botticelli's paintings, Donatello's sculptures, hears whispers about a strange genius named Leonardo. Some say surgeon, some lunatic, and immerses himself in the living, pulsing world of the Italian Quattrocento, 1400s. And one spring day in Rome, he finds himself attending a seminar on ancient Greek held in the Vatican. The room is full of humanists, bishops, poets, diplomats, and cardinals. At the lectern, none other than Ioannis Argyropoulos, a proud and imposing Greek scholar in exile who had fled Constantinople after it fell to the Ottomans. Argyropoulos was one of the most respected and arrogant teachers of his time. He translated Aristotle into Latin, taught Greek to Piero and Lorenzo de' Medici, moved in the most brilliant circles of the Renaissance Italy, and eventually died from eating too much watermelon at the age of 72. But while he lived, his pride and reputation were legendary. So when a young man from the retinue of some bearded Württemberg noble walked into his classroom, Argyropoulos addressed him in Greek and asked him to introduce himself. "I'm a German," said Johannes, "with modest knowledge of the Greek language." This was a scandalous thing to say. In the 1480s, even modest knowledge of Greek was rare in Catholic Europe, even in Italy, where the Renaissance had been bubbling for over a century. To say you were a German who knew Greek sounded at best like a bad joke and at worst like a challenge. So Argyropoulos decided to put the young man in his place. He handed him a volume of Thucydides. "Well then," he said, "if you would be so kind, please read aloud a passage from the history of the Peloponnesian War and translate it into Latin." He expected to humiliate the young German gentleman, but Johannes didn't move back or show fear. He glanced at the page and, to the shock of everyone present, began reading, smoothly, with no hesitation. And then, just as effortlessly, he translated it into Latin with elegance and style. The room fell silent. It felt as all of Rome held its breath. Argyropoulos paused for several long seconds, then something flickered in his voice, something close to admiration. "Holy Mother," he exclaimed in Greek, "because of our exile, Greece has flown across the Alps." The young German lawyer, whom the astonished Argyropoulos would nickname the Transalpine Greek, was named Johannes Reuchlin. And this remarkable little story happened to him nearly 30 years ago. And now in his hands, Johannes Reuchlin held a letter from the emperor, a firm reminder that the entire imperial court had been waiting for 2 months for his answer to a simple question: should Jewish books be destroyed? He was born in 1455 in Pforzheim, a little gingerbread German town on the edge of the Black Forest. Here, Reuchlin fell in love for the first time. Here, he formed his first friendship. Here, received his first communion. At 15, he left to study and over the years crossed half of Europe in pursuit of learning. He studied in Paris and Freiburg, Basel and Heidelberg. He learned from the French and the Florentines, the Greeks and the Jews, the Germans and the Romans, in short, from anyone who possessed knowledge. At the court of Eberhard the Bearded, he rose swiftly, becoming a brilliant legal advisor and diplomat. He also became one of the greatest language scholars in the Holy Roman Empire, adding to the standard Latin a mastery of ancient Greek and, more unusually, ancient Hebrew. That last one deserves special attention. In Reuchlin's day, a German with modest Greek was already a rare creature, but a German who could read Hebrew, that was almost unheard of. In the field of Hebraic studies, Reuchlin was a pioneer north of the Alps, a Christian scholar who believed the Renaissance motto ad fontes, back to the sources, should apply not only to the New Testament and classical texts, but also to the Hebrew Bible. All in all, by the age of 55, he was no longer a young German with modest Greek. Oh no. Now, he was one of the leading legal minds of his era, an advisor to princes, a senior magistrate of the Swabian League, a diplomat, a judge, a professor of Greek and Hebrew, author of the first Hebrew grammar printed in Europe, the most respected Christian reader of Jewish texts north of the Alps, master of arts, doctor of imperial law, a humanist par excellence. He could have retired in honor, taught quietly in Tübingen or Wittenberg, lived out his days in peace, surrounded by books and sunlight. But instead, In his hands was that cursed letter from the imperial court, and with it, that absurd, barbaric question: should all Jewish books be destroyed? Had they lost their mind? What kind of twisted, diseased person could conceive of such an idea to burn all Jewish books? And now that the idea had taken root, how could it possibly be stopped? Reuchlin saw all too clearly that the campaign started by Pfefferkorn had found powerful allies among the empire's most aggressive obscurants, among the most fanatical figures of both church and nobility, from obscure monks in Cologne to professors in high university chairs. So far, aside from a few cautious questions from the Frankfurt City Council and Heidelberg's polite plea for restraint, not a single Christian voice had publicly spoken in defense of Jewish books. Reuchlin was about to become the first and the only person willing to stand in front of this runaway wagon hitched to mad horses and barreling downhill. But what good would it do? He would be crushed, obviously, but would even that sacrifice be enough to stop the machine? Reuchlin had his doubts. All signs suggested that the emperor had already made up his mind and that the campaign would move forward no matter what his reply said, which meant this act of resistance would not only be dangerous, Reuchlin was fully aware it could end with his execution, but possibly useless. And yet, Reuchlin knew one thing with certainty. If it seems like the only way to save yourself is to betray yourself, don't believe it. That's a false path. Take it, and you lose both. So Reuchlin prayed, took a deep breath, and began to write. He knew if there was any hope of stopping this ship of fools, it would not be through passion, but through law. Where others had appealed to the emperor's feelings, Reuchlin would aim for his reason. So he wrote his response like a lawyer preparing for trial and produced a detailed 42-page document. In it, Reuchlin crushed Pfefferkorn's campaign point by point. He cited the Bible, church fathers, canon law, papal decrees, and civil law. First, he argued, Jewish books were private property, and imperial law forbids the seizure of private property from any citizen of the empire, Jew or not. Second, canon law agrees. It clearly states that Christians are forbidden under threat of excommunication from taking Jewish property or interfering in Jewish worship. Third, Jewish books do not harm Christianity as claimed by those who lack education and basic understanding of what they're talking about. On the contrary, these books benefit Christian faith. Saint Jerome called the Jews noble librarians of the Word of God. Pope Clement encouraged the study of Hebrew. Pope Sixtus ordered the translation of Kabbalistic texts into Latin, calling them a special blessing for our faith. Fourth, the accusations of heresy are not only absurd, they directly contradict canon law, which says Jews are not heretics. They are not members of the Christian Church, and their beliefs are not our concern. Fifth, as for the books in question, Reuchlin attached an appendix, a full survey of Jewish religious literature. He showed that none of the major works were guilty of the charges, save for two minor medieval texts which had already been condemned and removed by the rabbis themselves. And finally, sixth, to the question, should Jewish books be burned? Reuchlin answered, no. And there is more. We should open Hebrew studies departments. He spent more time on this final section than any other, rewriting it again and again until it felt exactly right. This is what he finally wrote. I'd like to take the liberty, as politely as possible, of saying that there are many theologians in our Christian faith who, because of their ignorance of the Hebrew and Greek, cannot interpret the Holy Scriptures correctly and have often made themselves look ridiculous. Therefore, we should not suppress the commentaries and glosses of men who have studied Hebrew thoroughly ever since their youth. Rather, we should acquire Jewish books and hold them in great esteem as if they were fountains from which the real meaning of the language and understanding of the Holy Scriptures flowed. With my slight understanding, my best advice is that His Imperial Majesty direct the universities of Germany, for the sake of God and our Christian faith, that each one hire 2 capable lecturers for a 10-year term who should teach and instruct our pupils and students in the Hebrew language. Jews living and residing in our land should help us in a good-hearted and neighborly spirit by lending us their books, assured against losses by an appropriate damage deposit. And we should preserve them with great respect for the language and the culture through which we come to understand the Word of God. This monumental work, with its citations of canon and civil law, precedents, cases, and more, took Reuchlin several weeks to complete. But even when it was finished, he didn't rush to send it. He delayed. Only on October 6, 1510, did he finally dispatch his answer to the emperor. It was the golden German autumn outside, perfect weather for long walks and slow, heavy thoughts. Most mornings he left his house in Stuttgart and wandered aimlessly through the countryside, hands behind his back, kicking at fallen leaves. A bitter joke, really, trading a quiet professional old age for the role of a sacrifice. I set out to be a pioneer in Hebrew studies, he thought, not a first martyr. That's not quite the same thing. They'll try to burn me alive, Pfefferkorn, Hochstraten, and the rest. But so be it. God will judge them. They chose their road. What I cannot understand, no matter how many hours I spend turning it over in my mind, is this: how can dozens, hundreds, thousands of educated, thoughtful, polite people not see what this is? How can they not see that this entire campaign is superstition, barbarism, and madness? How can professors from Mainz and Cologne, from Erfurt and Greifswald fail to see it? How can students, scribes, secretaries not see it? How can theologians, preaching love from the pulpit in the morning, spend their evenings repeating Pfefferkorn's pamphlets, stuffed with nothing but hatred and ignorance, ignorance and hatred, spreading like a rot across the empire, from the river Rhine to the Baltic Sea? He asked himself those questions again and again, but no answer ever came. Only silence, heavy and bitter, like the questions itself. That day, Reuchlin came home after dark. His second wife, Anna, 20 years younger than him, helped her husband out of his warm travel cloak, then finally asked the question that had been on her mind all day: who was it that came this morning asking for your letter? Oh, them. They're from the emperor. And what did he want? Oh, just wondering whether we should burn all the Jewish books. And you? Me? I told him we should open Hebrew departments at every university in Germany. Anna said nothing. She simply placed her arms around his shoulders. Somewhere nearby a dog barked, trees creaked, their golden leaves rustling in the wind. A window rattled. Far off, a single sad note rang out. Maybe a broken string, maybe a bucket dropped deep in the mines, or maybe the cry of a dark bird in the night. The city clock struck midnight. October 7th, 1510, had begun. Anna and Johannes stood like that for a long time, holding each other in silence, breathing in the uneasy scent of wood smoke, watching the cheerful little flames dance, and feeling in that flickering light the quiet end of the peaceful life they had known.